Thank you, judges. Thank you to my opponent. I'm going to jump right in. My opponent agreed with me at the beginning of his speech that we would disregard any points after the 4-minute mark. The definition of disregard is to ignore, take no notice, and therefore I do not agree with any of the points that my opponent made after the 4-minute mark, nor do I agree with any of the points that my opponent made in any of his speeches, and I have addressed all of his points. My opponent would like you to believe that paying money symbolizes a signal that we are sorry for the things that we've done. I will again state that why do we have to pay money in order to send a signal that we are sorry? Why can't we do something else? For the African American people. My opponent then goes on to say that reparations should be paid to African Americans because reparations were paid to Japanese Americans and Native Americans. Reparations in both of those cases were paid to the direct descendants or to the direct people who were abused in those situations. Who were abused in those situations. My opponent also failed to determine a significant need for reparations. So my opponent never stated why we need reparations in the world today. My opponent also stated that my citations were random Google sources, whereas the citations that I use are widely accepted citations, such as the CDC. He then goes on to say that reparations should be devised in a way to give the U.S. federal government time to pay taxes so that it does not hinder any economic development. This is a new argument. Judges, please do not allow him to come up with new plans. This is abuse of power to me. He should have addressed these things in his proposition. Then I could have addressed them accordingly. My opponent stated that I used minimum violence in my foot shooting analogy and the money would not help him feel better. So how would a lump sum of money help African Americans with an even greater form of violence feel better or symbolize feeling better whereas the money and minimum violence did not help him feel better? My opponent then is still ignoring the fact that taxpayers today would be responsible for paying these reparations. Just like in the analogy I used, if I were to murder someone, would my grandchildren have to pay for the reparations because they're not responsible for killing the person I was? My opponent also failed to address my point of where the money is coming from. My opponent failed to address who is determining who is receiving this money, like who gets the money, how much African American do you have to be. My opponent dropped my argument of where this money is coming from, and the resolution says you ought to do it. The American government ought to pay reparations to the African American people. Ought to implies that you can do something, and he never had a plan of how this is going to work. How can we pay reparations to all of these African American peoples? So my opponent failed to do this, and he failed to determine that the U.S. federal government was responsible. Therefore, my opponent dropped all of my arguments, and I should win based on the fact that he did not address any of my arguments, and which means he agreed with all of them. Thank you, judges. Thank you, my opponent.